Chapter 15. Good and Bad Ideas. Now everyone was reunited, the fell notions were permitted to stay below decks the following morning. They were finally back on course, and the thought of finding the next ingredient, the mermaid scales, weighed heavily on their minds. Well, almost everyone's. Annie's bad smell had to be taken in hand. The ATR would have probably ignored it for the rest of the journey if it meant a quiet life. Any suggestions or attempts at capture had been fruitless. To everyone's surprise, not least Annie herself, it was Tepid who took matters in hand. No one was sure how it happened. No one saw it coming. No one could tell if it was magic or some princely force. In one quick move, before she could even think about biting him, Annie had been dunked headfirst into the sea, clothes and all. Then she was sat down firmly, and her hair lathered in some extremely smelly, mud-like soap. Tepid calmly regaled her while he worked about how he met the most wonderful vendor of soap products, and it would be a shame to waste their hard work. But Annie was in far too much shock to listen. In 7 minutes, she went from pungent to purified, and everyone kept a nervous distance from Tepid from then on. He acted as if it was simply another chore, but it seemed that after his trip to the desert, his airy attitude was slipping to reveal glimpses of an unnerving cleverness. And so, as Abrian and the others huddled around the scrubbed table, Annie kept snorting large pink bubbles out her nose. These floated lazily over their carefully drawn and now heavily annotated map.
Pity your soapy friend couldn't have been a bit clearer about where the mermaid waters were,
said Honno, gazing blankly at the empty expanse of sea surrounding Tenga Shrew and resting his chin in his hands.
Boats being wrecked made me think it could be somewhere nearer land. Are you sure they said it was in open water?
Asked Abrian thoughtfully. Absolutely, Dominator nodded. The soap seller said their grandfather headed out for at least a dozen days at a time. But if he was sailing in one of the island's traditional vessels, those are a lot slower than our ship, said Morphea, sketching out a little drawing of those she'd seen growing up.
Abrian
did some sums on his fingers.
So, with our average speed against how long? Half a dozen?
It could be anywhere around here, interrupted Gina, drawing a line across the map. Right? They all peered at the map closely. Abrian shrugged.
More or less, yes. But I think there must be a book I brought from home which has some useful notes on the natural history of the area. With a bit more studying and a few more sums, I reckon I'll be able to work out the exact spot. EA, do you have that one somewhere?
EA looked up distractedly.
Yes, I think I know the one you mean.
Morphea frowned. You're actually awake today. No big blue book, I see. EA avoided her gaze.
I seem to have misplaced it.
His foot tapped nervously under the table.
Ah, well.
Abrian patted him on the back.
You can make yourself useful researching these mermaids with me. But after you've got a good night's sleep, you don't look well,
he added. EA nodded in a way that made absolutely no promises, his foot still tapping. That takes us to our second problem, said Dominator, leaning on the map. If it's where Gina thinks it is, the map says those waters are very, very deep. It's all well and good sailing there, but how do we look for the scales all that way underwater? I can do it, said Gina at once. I can engage my element and stay down there for ages. Sounds like fun, Annie squeaked in a little flurry of bubbles. Wish I could do that. I thought you said you had problems with engaging your element, chimed in GA to Gina, looking at them upside down from the ceiling, his favourite spot for listening in. You couldn't control it and EA had to help you go solid again. Gina stared at GA, opened her mouth, then shut it again. Oh, yes, I forgot. Thanks, GA. She slowly sat back down, her face looking like thunder. GA wondered if he'd said the wrong thing. Abrian cleared his throat.
Actually, GA, you would be good.
Me? Remarked GA, spinning the right way up.
Why him?
Said EA, surprised. Abrian looked at everyone as if the answer was obvious.
Who else can hide in the moat for days on end when they want to?
Gina raised her hand surreptitiously despite herself.
And who else doesn't need to breathe? Doesn't even get wet?
Abram went on. But I can't collect any scales, said G.A., flapping his translucent hands through Abrian's head.
You wouldn't have to,
cut in Honno, starting to understand what Abrian had in mind.
All you have to do is scout about, see if there's any signs of scales, and then come back and tell us where to look. Then I can dive down there with my element engaged.
Abrian added brightly.
Should be enough to stay watery for about 20 minutes without getting too tired.
Gina was about to say she could easily manage longer and she'd be happy to help, but then remembered she wasn't supposed to be able to do all that. You can even guide the way, G.A., said Morphea, her eyes shining at the idea, but Delilah raised a hand. Sorry, will it be safe down there? I mean... She pushed her fringe out of her face self-consciously. I'm as sceptical as the rest of you about mermaids wrecking boats, but what will we do if there is an angry horde of fish people down there? That's why I'd go first, said G.A. happily. I'll tell the others if it's safe or not to swim down there. Sounds like a plan to me, declared Annie, snorting out a bubble with a confidence that said the matter was settled. I'll notify the captain, get him to adjust our course, said Morphea, rolling up the map and following after Dominator, Honno, and a still hiccuping Annie. When they'd left, Gina threw her head on the table. Delilah didn't look altogether pleased at the plan either. When G.A. looked questioningly at her, she sighed. That wasn't really what I meant when I asked if it would be safe down there. What do you mean? Asked G.A. confused. But Abrian thought he knew what was bothering her.
Delilah, there is another reason why it's a good thing for G.A. to go down first. Here, G.A., hold up your arm, please.
G.A. obliged, watching curiously as Abrian explained.
When you wave your arms through him, you feel how much colder he is than the rest of us, right?
Yes, said Delilah slowly.
Well, I've got a theory that the part of the sea we're heading to will be warm. Quite a lot warmer, in fact. We can't feel G.A. or poke him, but his presence changes the temperature a bit. So I think when he goes in the warm sea, it will react, start steaming or something. Because he won't warm up, the steam should keep rising, and we can track him for a while until he goes really deep. The steam will mean you should be able to see where he is, and we can see where we need to go.
Ah, I hadn't thought of that, said G.A. Delilah didn't look convinced that steam would make her worries go away.
Anyway,
said Abrian, also getting up from the table,
we don't really have any other options, or time. Now, I've got the feeling Pippa's snuck off to dig in Morland's fruit tree pot again. If I don't catch her, that little so-and-so will be in such trouble.
G.A. watched him hurry off to the sailors' quarters, feeling elated. He was going to be a vital part of their mission. He was going to be useful. Delilah really didn't want to burst his happy bubble, especially when he was twitching his tail out of excitement in that adorable way. She decided to take her thoughts elsewhere for the time being. She still couldn't understand why she was worried about someone who was almost indestructible anyway. Gina rolled off the table and trudged after her, but paused next to E.A., who had stayed seated. I hope you find your book, she said quietly. Just say if you want help looking for it.
I'll find it,
replied E.A., equally as quiet and without making eye contact. G.A.'s ears pricked up at once. Did those two speak to each other just then? Gina sniffed and stomped back up the steps. As soon as she was out of sight, E.A. fell forwards onto the table.
I'm never going to find it,
he moaned.
Where's it gone?
Do you want me to help? G.A. asked, slightly bemused at his brother's despair.
I've already searched the whole ship, G.A.,
said E.A. miserably. G.A. couldn't resist it. Gina offered to help too, he said coyly. E.A. shook his head, his face still buried in the table. Are you a little shy? G.A. arched an eyebrow as his brother pushed himself upright.
I am sleep-deprived. I am not mentally unstable. I'm fine,
he said, getting up and promptly colliding with the ladder.
That book's got to be somewhere.
As the day drew on, it was clear things were not fine, and G.A. was sure he knew what it was. He didn't have long to wait before something else came along that raised his hopes even higher. The rain was a little softer that day. The droplets were pattering gently on the canvas, and the sky was showing rare glimpses of blue amidst its rolling greys and whites. G.A. was enjoying an afternoon off from the watch. Half of the crew had gone below decks for some rest, while the other half were just emerging. He had floated up to the whipstaff, where Bligh was teaching Adrian the basics of astronavigation. Adrian looked enraptured. Whatever it all meant must have been fascinating, but G.A. found his attention pulled away by something on the deck below. Gina had her legs hooked in the shrouds that led to the rigging and was hanging upside down. The surf was racing and splashing beneath her, and she didn't seem to mind the rain in the slightest. Her hair streamed out alongside the ship like thick golden string. G.A. looked about to see if anyone else had noticed. Captain Oola would have been sure to suggest she try the activity without legs, but at that moment he was shut in his cabin. Then he spotted his brother coming down from the yard. Gina was blocking the way and apparently didn't see him. G.A. watched, fascinated, as E.A. stayed on the ladder, not moving. Any other person would have called out and asked her to shift. Instead, E.A. stayed where he was above her, not moving at all. "Why don't you just get out of each other's way?" G.A. wondered to himself. Minutes ticked by and still Gina hadn't moved, and E.A. didn't speak up. "This is ridiculous!" laughed G.A. and flew over to them. "Are you stuck, E.A.?" he asked, grinning. E.A. jumped as if G.A. had just pinched him. Gina looked up in surprise. "Oh, hello, G.A. Have you tried this? It's like you can feel the boat breathing," she said, pulling herself upright and lowering herself back onto the deck. "Though it does make the blood go to your head a bit," she added. "I wouldn't know," said G.A. "I haven't got any." He watched his brother cautiously descend the ladder after her. That old thought was burning merrily in his mind. Ever since the night he tailed E.A. all the way to Aunt Bolivia's house, he hadn't been able to stop it growing irresistibly bigger and brighter inside him. "Hey, E.A., have you had a go at hanging upside down?" he asked. "I remember we used to do it a lot when we were all younger." E.A. looked as if he'd been about to sneak away, but stopped short.
"Not really,"
he said quietly. "Ah, that's a shame," said G.A. cheerfully. "Maybe Gina could show you." E.A. shot his brother a glance, trying to work out what he was up to. "Anyone can hang upside down, G.A., said Gina. "You're best at it, though. Your hair never seems to bother you. Mine gets in my face all the time."
"You have to tie it back,"
muttered E.A. "Pardon?" asked G.A., but to his delight he realised E.A. was speaking to Gina.
"You have to tie long hair out of the way or it will get knotted."
"G.A. never did that when you told him to." "I remember from when we were smaller," said Gina, the corners of her mouth twitching nervously.
"I know."
G.A. could scarcely believe what he was hearing. Were they actually chatting? He stayed absolutely still, not wanting to miss a thing. Neither of them said anything for a moment. E.A. felt his hands begin to shake. "I like my hair down, I think," said Gina at length. "It doesn't get that knotted." Her eyes looked slightly overbright. "I could show you how to plait hair," suggested G.A., desperate to stop any kind of silence between them. "I learned from the street kids. Some of the younger ones love to mess about with our hair." Really?" Gina asked. "Of course," beamed G.A. "E.A., can you help me? Solid hands and all that, you know."
"I don't need to plait my hair,"
said E.A., shaking his head. "I wasn't meaning your hair, you daft," thought G.A. furiously to himself. "I think I have too much to plait. My hair likes to eat things. I keep losing stuff in it," said Gina. She'd begun edging back to the ladder again, but her eyes kept darting back to E.A.
"That's why you tie hair back,"
muttered E.A. He felt a ringing in his ears and he was starting to feel sick. G.A. watched them both, hardly able to contain his excitement. It was so beautifully familiar. Gina shuffled her feet restlessly and blinked hard. She looked up abruptly. "I'm going to listen to the boat again," she said, and hopped back onto the side. "You can too if you want." G.A. wasn't sure who she'd spoken to. He turned around, but EA had already set off in the other direction, leaving him alone with Gina. Sensing things had finished for now, GA calmly headed down the hatch below decks to a nook behind the stairs. Then he gave himself a little shake and a squeak of excitement. They were just like he and Delilah had been. It was wonderful. In the calm of his cabin, Oola checked the small hourglass on his desk, put down his quill and tidied his charts. Closing the door and stepping out onto the deck, he thought he saw a long haystack unravelling on the port side. His eyes fell on Gina, who was dangling upside down again. Her arms hung limply as if she couldn't summon the strength to lift them. He also saw Abrian trying to look through the wrong end of a sextant. Beside him, Pippa the dragon was trying to swallow a fish head whole. Taking all this in his stride, Oola made to step forward but almost tripped over something lying in the way. EA was on his knees, clutching the rail and shaking all over. Oola stood still, calmly observing his new doormat. After a short pause, he opened his cavern door again.
Inside.
EA didn't protest and staggered limply to his feet.
Stay in there until you've sorted yourself out,
said Oola firmly.
Touch anything, and I will have your fingers removed.
EA nodded bleakly, then suddenly had to seize a waste paper basket. Oola rolled his eyes.
A ship of drama queens,
he muttered to himself as he pulled the door shut again. The shining idea that there was something romantic going on between his brother and Gina left GA in a considerably good mood. He calmly shook off EA's absence at that night's mealtime, assuming he was probably off somewhere buried in a book. Later, GA occupied himself with keeping Gina company, hanging upside down with her and making conversation. He could scarcely resist the urge to let her know how much of a reliable brother-in-law he would make. After all, he reasoned, there was no harm in giving them both a little nudge in the right direction. Gina seemed grateful someone was talking to her, and, for a while, she stayed in the rigging with GA. She was distracted, though, and her mind appeared to be on other things. Suddenly GA looked up and realised she had left and was clambering down the shrouds and disappearing below. He shrugged, presuming this was one of those times when people went all thoughtful, just like he and Delilah had done in those earlier days. Something was up. Honno knew it. He watched GA floating above them, smiling strangely to himself in a happy bubble. Despite his aloofness, Honno wasn't ignorant. Growing up alongside his 4 cousins had given him a nose for situations like these, when things seemed perfectly safe and cheerful, and no one spoke a word. He had been in the midst of many such dangerous situations with Betrin and Tessa. It was like stepping outside and realising it had started snowing. People like GA might think it was beautiful, but Honno had learned to tread carefully. Peaceful snow often concealed deep, dangerous drifts. Gina was in a very peculiar mood. EA was probably about to expire from sleeplessness, and GA was trying to get them to hug? Whatever fantasy the ghost was entertaining, he was clearly oblivious to any danger. Someone had to sort this whole mess out, and Honno had a niggling feeling it was he who was going to come out of it with a broken nose. Acting nonchalant, he called a good night to GA and slipped below. But instead of turning towards his hammock, he headed in the direction of the forecastle. A lantern was swinging from its hook. Delilah had been doing her rounds illuminating the ship. Apart from its squeaking, all was quiet. He reached the door where he'd found Abrian sleeping all that time ago, after they'd set out from Maemia and the Aral Isle. He pressed his ear to the door, listening carefully to the innocent silence on the other side. Holding his arm protectively in front of his nose and taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. To his credit, he managed to dodge the hairbrush as it flew through the air and embedded itself in the door frame, but he hadn't anticipated the travelling case. "Go away!" He stumbled upright, but a pair of hiking boots knocked him back, then a soup flask, and then a looking-glass. "Gina, stop it! Ah! Go away, Honno! I didn't do it!" yelled Gina, flinging a haversack, an empty bowl, and a Schnoemann boot at her cousin.
I didn't say you... Ouch! Did anything yet?
It wasn't me!
No, I...
Honno ducked before he could finish. And you didn't knock!
Would you?
A heavy blue book sailed towards his nose, but he caught it just in time.
Hang on, isn't this...
Not that one! Gina snatched the book back again and sat on it, then looked at him as he stared at her. What?
That's EA's book,
said Honno slowly.
The book that he's been reading all the time that he said he lost.
Realization dawned on him harder than a broken nose.
Gina, you stole it?
No, I didn't, she protested, sitting down harder on the book. Leave me alone. Honno quickly shut the door in case anyone was passing. A brave move considering the fury he was shutting himself in with. It's EA's fault, said Gina, pulling the book further out of Honno's reach and clutching it tight. I had to take it. Honno rubbed his head, his mind hurting. The rest of him wasn't feeling much better either.
You're not a bad person, Gina. You don't steal things. First you fake your element problem. Now you're nicking books. What are you doing this for?
Gina looked at him with wide, angry eyes. I want my friend back. Honno frowned.
You what?
I just want my friend back. I wanted to come back so I could have fun and be alive again with everyone. And I missed having friends. I know I annoy people and no one will work with me because I get stuff wrong. EA was on my side when we were little, but now we're all grown up. He won't even look at me. And I've tried everything to make him talk. I thought if I turned into a puddle more and more, he'd have to say something to me eventually. But nothing! She slammed her hands against the wall in frustration and kicked the bunk. I hate how much he won't talk and how different he is. I suppose it's something to do with me dying, but it wasn't his fault I ran onto that knife. Delilah stopped in reading one night, and before I knew it, I'd taken that stupid book. I waited for him to tell us he'd lost it so I could help him find it again, but nothing! She kicked something else. Honno was careful to keep out of range. I don't want to be on my own when everyone thinks I'm stupid, she continued more quietly. I want to have my friend back. Having EA as my friend made everything so much better. I want to have an adventure with my friends, just like we said we would when we were little. Because being a grown-up and having everyone tell you what to do and what you should be is so horrible. Honno waited for her to finish, staying on the alert in case she threw anything else at him. But it seemed she'd run out of energy. She sat clutching the book, looking as if it was sapping her will to live, and for the first time, Honno realised she looked mightily sad.
I'm sorry,
he said at last.
I've been rotten to you lately. You're so loud and daft sometimes, I forget you've missed so much.
Gina looked at him suspiciously. What do you mean? Honno thought for a moment how to say what was on his mind.
Well, so much happened when you died. I think EA and GA have seen too much, but you've seen too little.
Gina blinked but said nothing.
Well,
he said at length.
In all honesty, I'm worried about EA. He's up to something with all that reading and making himself ill in the process. Something must be going on he's not telling us about. And I think he could do with a friend like you, even if he doesn't realise it. If you want my advice, if you want someone to be your friend again, stop drawing attention to yourself and try being a friend to them instead.
How do I do that? Asked Gina.
I don't know,
Honno replied.
I'm not weird enough to understand how your head or an Aluicious' head works.
Honno opened the door, leaving Gina still holding the book.
Oh,
he paused.
And be careful of GA. He thinks you and EA have, are forging romantic connections.
Gina pulled a face.
Exactly,
said Honno, relieved that he was right on that account too. He slid out through the doorway, wincing slightly. Gina trudged dejectedly to the captain's cabin. She felt terrible. If everyone found out she'd stolen the book, EA would probably hate her, and they'd all think she was even more trouble than she already was. If she could make it look as if she'd found the book and handed it innocently to the captain for him to judge who it belonged to, no one would be any the wiser. Pushing her hair out of her eyes, she knocked gingerly on the door.
Ah, excellent,
said Oola upon opening it and seeing her.
It's high time one of you came to fetch this.
Before Gina could speak, he reached under his desk and pulled out a very pale EA.
He's probably well enough to go back to his own quarters now, thank you,
the captain said, placing the miserable failed notion firmly outside the door.
A good night's sleep and a proper meal would be beneficial as well,
he added before shutting it.
Failed notions cannot photosynthesize.
EA nodded, without a clue what Oola meant. The rain was quite heavy and EA made to head down the steps, but something knocked against his head. Gina stood there, holding out a book but not looking at him. In the dim light of the lantern beside the cabin door, he recognised its deep blue cover. "Take it, my arms are getting tired," said Gina, with her eyes still fixed on the timber wall. EA took it slowly, not sure if what he felt was relief or if he was going to be sick again. The book was just the same as before, heavy and full of small narrow writing and diagrams. Even the bookmark was where he had left it. Gina clenched her teeth, wanting the deck to swallow her up.
Thank you.
Her head whipped round. EA was looking straight at her, making eye contact as best he could and holding the book tight.
Thank you so much,
he said, every word filled with sincerity. Gina didn't know if she felt overjoyed or ashamed. "Don't mention it," she said quietly. The rain pattered on the rail, and up in the lookout point they could faintly hear G.A. humming to himself. "What's it about?" she said after a pause. E.A. glanced down at the book briefly, then back at Gina.
It's a book about ghosts.
Far away from ships and the sea, it was late afternoon in Feldnor. That bothersome ghost hadn't left young Aluiciuous Mabon alone all day. Jan was readjusting to life in the living world bit by bit. The trick was remembering that reality wasn't as flexible as it had been in the netherworld. He couldn't disappear whenever he wanted or walk on both the sky and the ground at the same time. It wasn't that he felt ungrateful for being pulled out of that place, with its peculiar spirits wandering the vast, blank landscapes. Time had taken a long walk in the netherworld and seemed to have lost its way, but Jam still managed to get bored. Except when he was evading those irritating guardians of the netherworld, the Netherwatchers, who had been out to catch him ever since he'd accidentally broken in. All the same, now back in the living world, he was furious to discover he was still avoiding irritating guardians. The White Queen hadn't let him out of her sight since rescuing him that first night. Worse still, it transpired she had a small daughter, a ghost named Everlu, who would pop out of nowhere at the least convenient and most annoying times. On this particular afternoon, as the rain continued falling down the chimney, as Jam tried to fix it, she had been hovering upside down beside him, watching silently. Ghosts had a habit of doing this, apparently. Jam never could cope with small, silent, observant persons. It made him feel nervous when he didn't know what they were planning. However, as soon as he pointed this out, Everlu, of course, started talking. Jam soon remembered he hated this even more. At last, the damper stayed in place and Jam was able to pull it shut, stemming both the flow of rainwater and the conversation from Everlu, who had been watching from inside the flue. "I still think you should put something in the top of the chimney," she said, floating through the wall as he struggled out from the fireplace.
"Children should be seen and not heard,"
he muttered.
"And I've already seen enough of you. Please go and harass your mother."
"I'm not a child," said Everlu indignantly. "I was 228 times old last summer."
"Oh, good grief. You're still using times as a unit of measure?"
Jam threw his makeshift tools into a corner and went to wash his hands in a bucket nearby.
You know, I once read that some forward-thinking places use the term moth. Was it monad? Times was probably made up by someone who likes using odd words for the sake of it. Age is far better measured in years.
"How old are you, then?" asked Everlu slyly. Jam pointedly ignored her. "Don't worry," Everlu went on. "Mama already told me. I could tell you it in years if you like," she added with a smirk.
No, thank you.
"I would be almost 20 years old, you know."
Well, you haven't aged a day,
said Jam, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice as he began mending a leaking patch of the ceiling with a spoon. There wasn't much in his house, nor did he know much about mending things, so he was having to use his imagination. "Of course not. Not an hour since the day I died," said Everlu, observing the hole in the mould around it. "Ghosts don't age at all. Unlike you with those little grey hairs, she sniggered.
Disrespectful child. They're silver,
said Jam, keeping his focus firmly on the hole.
Children speed up the aging process, drain the life out of you.
Oh, you poor old person. No wonder you ran away. Evelyn sighed, her arms folded.
Now see here,
said Jam, brandishing the spoon at her.
I've fled Fealdnor for very good reasons, which shall remain undisclosed. I left my sons under the presumption your mother, the guardian of Fealdnor, would do her job and take care of them. And now where are they, I ask you? Off and away, getting up to who cares what?
Mamma says it was your job, actually, Evelyn muttered.
If she,
Jam pointed the spoon violently towards the open front door,
is going to once again infer that because I stuck those twins together, which I didn't know was irreversible, and then left Fealdnor to keep them safe, it reflects poorly on my parenting skills, I would like to bring to her attention her queenliness is hardly a model parent herself.
Outside, the White Queen's ears pricked up. She had been reclining by the front door, petting a snapping turtle that had started following her around. Now, however, she was listening with much more interest as Jam continued.
All that wandering off, drifting about, being mysterious. I hardly remember seeing her all through the time I was working hard, raising Joji and the other one.
He turned back to battering at the ceiling with the spoon. Evelyn looked at her mother, who now stood in the open doorway, appearing both surprised and slightly impressed, like a parent whose child has just used a swear word for the first time.
Besides,
Jam went on,
they're all grown up now and off, adventuring in the wide outside. I hardly understand why you insist I am a necessary part of their lives, or unlives in Joji's case.
He sniggered at his own joke.
It is because of your son's unlife that you are extremely necessary,
said the White Queen, stooping as she strode into the house. She took up quite a lot of space. The snapping turtle followed, settling down on her long white hair where it pooled on the floor. Jam glanced her way but continued beating at the ceiling.
That was a lot of words for you,
he said obstinately.
Joji has it better than all of us. I saw him briefly, you know, both of them, in fact, back in the Netherworld. They'd fallen for a magical trap I left on some old documents of mine and had been pulled through the fabric of reality. Joji was a ghost, and the other one...
Eldred, cut in Evelyn. Jam waved the spoon in affirmation.
That one was alive, a little heavy on the stitches and just as unwilling as ever. They could have been my way out of there if I hadn't smelt those wretched nether-watchers on the prowl. I ran for it before they even came close. When I went back, Joji and Eldred had escaped. I admit I'm surprised, though.
He suddenly looked thoughtful.
I thought the twins were dead. I heard it in Nausea when they announced the end of the war.
He stopped hitting the hole in the ceiling and looked at it blankly.
Some errand runner burst through the meeting hall, shouting. All those dratted councillors crowded round talking. They were always talking. Then they were cheering, passing round the news. The prince had killed the witch. The failed nations had done their part, no casualties except for their captains, who were found at the edge of the forest. And everyone was cheering.
He rubbed his forehead with his free hand, talking as if he had forgotten Evelyn and the White Queen were there.
And now those durable twins have come back, all on their own.
Jam paused. Then he looked back to the hole with a business-like manner.
Like I said, Joji and Eldred seem more than capable of managing on their own. They obviously have so far.
Apart from dying, Evelyn added.
And being a ghost reduces Joji's problems by half.
The White Queen shook her head.
On the contrary, my dear young Aluiciuous, it has multiplied them.
Well, Madam here is a ghost and seems irritatingly happy,
Jam said, pointing accusingly at Evelyn. But I'm a White Queen's daughter, explained Evelyn. When Mama passes away, her spirit is going to help me get to the next world. I get special dispensation, she said proudly.
I fail to see your point,
said Jam dismissively.
If Joji were in any sort of trouble, you can guarantee his brother will help him out of it. They've been a unit even before I stuck them together.
The White Queen sighed. For all his observance, Jam was so short-sighted. If it weren't for the urgency of the situation, she would certainly feel sorry for him. Perhaps it was time things were made clear.
Your sons are about to realise they can't help each other any further,
she said slowly.
The problem is already out of their hands.
Jam stopped and turned to her, his eyebrows knitting together.
What problem?
It was very late at night and EA was still awake. The candle in the little lantern was almost burnt down to its stub. He forced himself upright. Finally reunited with his book, he had now almost finished it. A twisting, anxious feeling gripped him as he turned the faded page and saw the last few paragraphs. Leaning in as close as he could to see by the dim light, he read on.
To conclude these essays, ghosts, I believe, are made up of thought and consciousness. Retention of their sense of self allows them to maintain a shape and form as echoes of their former living bodies. However, the longer a person stays a ghost, it is likely they will begin to drift. An echo of life is not life itself. Being spirits caught between life and death, they have no need of air to breathe, food to sustain themselves, warmth or shelter. The more they see themselves as separate from all things vital to the living world around them, a ghost will either become isolated or indeed will isolate themselves. It is therefore inevitable that over time a ghost will forget aspects of their former life no longer vital to them. The things necessary for the living that simply aren't necessary for themselves to sustain their existence. What a ghost is vastly reliant upon are memories. Companionship and positive interactions with the living allow for the creation of memories, which in turn allow for the successful imitation of life. The more of life that is forgotten, the more a ghost will cease to subconsciously imitate it. When this happens, they will begin to lose their lifelike form. Sadly, a ghost cannot age. Their form is not affected by the weathering of time, and it is this that causes the greatest rift between ghosts and the living. All companions will leave over time, friendships will part, life will move on, but a ghost can never move with it. Instead, they must watch the gradual aging of their loved ones in a ceaseless cycle that cannot touch them. Through my observations, I have learned over long expanses of time, as the world continues to change about them, a ghost will inevitably forget and continue to do so, leading them to decrease. They will forget they were once a person and know only what they are becoming, a shapeless mist of lost thoughts. I can only theorize what becomes of ghosts when even their mist ceases to be visible. Presumably they remain as a presence in places they once knew and which held a significance for them, though these places, through the waxing of the ages, will have altered beyond all their recognition. If, as the holy texts say, wisdom cannot be mined from the depths of the earth, or found in the sky or the land, how then can a being of thought be taken and saved by your hand? Ghosts are, therefore, the saddest beings I have documented. Sorrowful lords of unwithering age, captive slaves of time. They are bound to this, their never-ending reign.
EA flicked to the next page, but it was blank. He turned more pages, but only found the book's hardback cover. He could feel panic rising. Something inside him was unravelling out of his grip. Ever since the fight at the ruins, when the White Queen had dissolved the red magic and GA had transformed back into a ghost, EA had slowly realised something couldn't be right. After all this work, he'd reached a dead end. He had hoped against hope for an answer, but the answer was his worst fear. GA would slowly forget everything about the living world. EA could already see it happening. Each day he saw him slipping away from his former life, becoming more of a ghost. His brother was trapped. He would watch all his friends pass away before slowly losing himself, and there was no way EA could stop it. EA knew he had to tell him. Then GA would be ready to fight against forgetting while they searched for a way to save him. But the thought of telling his brother made EA's eyes burn. GA was so happy, so unaware. Maybe he'd put it off. GA kept out of trouble. He wasn't in any danger for now. There must be an answer. EA must have missed something. This book was their only chance. The candle had gone out, but EA pulled himself upright. He was going to read the book again. He'd read it all day and every night if he had to.